Cities have spent billions on bike lanes, bus lanes, and curb infrastructure. And the research is clear. Protected infrastructure works. Where you build it, collisions drop, cyclists feel safer, people shift to bikes. The problem is we don't have enough protected infrastructure. Only 19 to 30% of bike lanes nationally are physically protected, and the funding to close that gap is getting harder to find, not easier. So what do you do when you can't build your way out of a problem? Well, today we're talking about what enforcement can do in the meantime. Welcome to Parking Live, where the curb meets the conversation. I'm Matt Darst, and I'll be covering for Jade this week while she's on leave. We just got back from IPMI 2026 in Milwaukee, and one of the highlights for me was co-presenting with today's guest, Matthew Willenbrink. Matthew is account executive for parking at Genetec, and he brings the vendor side perspective to some of the most active automated enforcement deployments in the country. Matthew, welcome to Parking Live.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be talking with you again here today.
Absolutely. So for listeners who weren't at IPMI or who are in cities that are just starting to think about automated enforcement, can you give us your 30-second version of what Genetec does in this space?
Yeah, sure. And we've been working in this space for over a decade now. We've been doing a centralized enforcement workflow where the citations aren't processed and put onto a windshield, but reviewed in a back office type environment and then mailed out for a number of years in Europe. That's now starting to shift and becoming more prevalent, and more of our customers in North America are asking for this type of workflow. And with that, we get to do other things besides just parking tickets. So we're doing back office management. It makes it much easier to do that centralized enforcement for those fringe use cases that are more at the curb. So things like the bike lanes, bus lanes, loading zones, street cleaners, that type of thing.
That's awesome. Yeah, it is newer in the United States, but we're starting to see some real traction. So let's start with the problem. Cities are investing heavily in protected bike lanes and dedicated bus lanes. But as I noted, nationally, a very small percentage of those lanes are actually protected by physical infrastructure, and the rest are painted. You said something that really stuck with me. Paint doesn't enforce itself. What does that mean?
Yeah, I really love that line. That's one of my favorite lines from the presentation we gave. And, put simply, just by marking the roads doesn't mean that people are going to comply with it. If there isn't an enforcement component to it that really deters people from driving in those lanes and violating the laws that are put in place, they're not going to abide by just having paint on the road alone. There needs to be an enforcement component that really puts some meat behind what those lines on the road mean.
There was actually an interesting independent analysis that just came out that was looking at Chicago's Smart Streets program. They had FOIA data through April of this year. And one of the findings that jumped out was that violations concentrate heavily on paint-only segments, but then drop significantly on protected stretches in the same corridor. The easy read is build protected bike lanes and the problem goes away, but cities can't get there quickly. What does enforcement data actually tell you beyond the obvious?
It is pretty obvious. If it's a protected bike lane or a bus lane, it's easy to comply because, unless someone's driving over the curb, it's very hard to actually do a violation in one of those zones. We typically see that the violations that occur when it's an unprotected bike lane or bus lane, particularly the bike lanes, it goes up exponentially. We see massive amounts more violations occurring, more tickets are given in those areas, whether it's using a centralized enforcement tool or traditional methods. The simple answer is, people are going to drive in those lanes and they're going to break the rules if it's not protected, which creates real challenges. Going back to what you just mentioned before, if cities can't build the infrastructure or don't have the funds to build the infrastructure for those protected lanes, they have to find new and more creative ways to actually enforce those and get the compliance in those areas that they want.
Well, I think that's a great segue, Matthew, into Chicago specifically. Can you set the context for listeners? What is the program? How did it start?
Sure. They're doing a program that's basically a pilot program for using centralized enforcement. So having the patrol vehicles with LPR do all of the reads and captures of the violations in the field, but not actually issue the citations in the field. So what they do on the back end is have someone review them in a back office tool and then mail out those citations. This pilot started in November 2024, where we deployed 8 of their existing vehicles with an enhanced LPR system with some additional cameras to capture some additional views of the road. They started the pilot in November. We installed in October of 2024. They had a 30-day warning period. So once they were up and running, they were not issuing any live citations, but just issuing warnings to people. And then in the end of 2024, so beginning in December, they actually started issuing real violations and tickets to people. The first offense of those programs, so the first time a person was in violation, they got a warning. The second offense, the fines ranged anywhere between $90 and $250. So it was $90 for a bus lane and $250 for a bike lane. Fast forwarding to April of 2025, they started doing route optimization, and moving forward even into 2026, we're now doing centralized enforcement for meter violations, so paid parking sessions. And beginning last month, we just started piloting street cleaning violations as well. So looking at people parked on the left side of the street on, no parking from Tuesdays from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. or whatever it is for the street cleaning. We're now doing violation management for those as well. Overall, it's been going great. They've expanded the footprint. They're probably going to be expanding vehicles. So far, it's been highly successful.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because the data case for this existed a long time ago. Thousands of collisions with bicyclists. In fact, in 2023, something like 87% of them resulted in serious physical harm. But it really took the death of a child, tragically, named Lily Shambrook, to galvanize political will to implement Chicago's Smart Streets program. Matthew, if you're a city that has the data but hasn't yet experienced a tragedy like that, how do you make the case for something like this before that terrible event occurs?
First of all, it's really tragic that happened in Chicago. Talking with a number of colleagues that work in Chicago and live there, remember when it happened. So it's near and dear to a lot of us at Genetec, our hearts. It's incredibly disappointing that it does sometimes take something like that to happen in order to make the change. And it's a real challenge to try and find ways to motivate policymakers to make these shifts proactively. One of the biggest things is the numbers. Not only can we reduce the number of incidents that happen, people that get injured, but clearing these lanes out. When a vehicle is parked in a bike or a bus lane, if it's a loading truck and they're double parked there because they need to do their deliveries, it creates problems, not only for the people trying to travel in those lanes, but also for traffic as a whole. So it creates all sorts of other problems in the city. And I think, helping cities understand it's not just about making a clean bike lane or a bus lane. It's about helping reduce traffic congestion, helping the overall flow of everything else in the city that's going to make your traffic move better. It's going to reduce emissions. If people are getting from point A to point B easier and there's less traffic, it's going to make it easier for emergency vehicles. It's all of these other things that take place just because one simple lane is blocked. It's not really an easy one-size-fits-all answer to give to cities to get them to change. But one of the biggest things is the dollar amount, the amount of additional revenue and the increased operational efficiency you can achieve from working in this manner can make huge differences.
You discussed the problem, and for a bicyclist that is using a bike lane, when a vehicle cuts in front of them in that lane, the natural reaction is to swerve. And unfortunately, you're more often than not swerving into traffic. And that was, in fact, the case that led to the tragedy in Chicago, where you had a utility truck pull into the bike lane suddenly, and then the mom swerved into traffic and was hit, unfortunately, by a semi. We are, though, as you alluded, I think, witnessing less and less of that. Can you tell me a little bit about the behavioral change you've seen in Chicago?
Yeah, sure. Couple things. One, the compliance rate has gone up. So the number of people that are actually paying tickets that they get has gone up. We're also seeing recidivism down. So the number of people that are getting repeat offenses, and in Chicago, that's typically measured by someone getting a second ticket within 90 days of getting their first ticket. That number has dropped by about half. So I think it went from about 15% down to about 7% and some change during the course of this pilot program so far. So it's seen success. And what that really means at the end of the day is when people think they're being watched and they have a chance of getting a ticket, they're going to comply. And that's really the short answer. It takes that compliance and the fear of getting a pretty steep ticket to keep people from breaking the rules. Another thing that you mentioned during our presentation that I thought was really great is you said something like, if they even just wrote on the curb photo enforced, it would probably increase compliance. I think simple things like that, they point to the fact that if people think that they're being watched, they're going to pay attention and they're going to comply with the rules.
Yeah, I mean, it is an amazing, a 51% reduction in recidivism since implementation in Chicago is pretty amazing. And I think it's that success that's led to an expansion of the program, both in size and scope. You spoke a little bit about that. Can you tell me just kind of how that occurred?
Yeah. They began with kind of the core central downtown area. I forget off the top of my head how many square miles it was. Blocking it out, doing route optimization. We did not do that at Genetec. That was a piece that Trellant did. They were looking at the routes so that the vehicles that were monitoring and doing the enforcement didn't have to do these U-turns on streets, making it really easy for them. So they were actually operating more efficiently, covering more ground more efficiently during shifts. And with that, we saw, pretty good success in the first 6 months, year of the program. And they decided to double the footprint this year. So it's now twice the size that it was before. Still using all those same tools, just now covering more use cases and more bike lanes and bus lanes.
At least for bus and bike lanes. I know the other aspects of this expansion have really yet to get underway in a meaningful way. But the data at least shows that warnings are maybe the most significant component of the violation counts, which in my mind is exactly how you want it to work, because the point shouldn't be to generate revenue. It really should be to change behavior. What do you use as a metric for whether or not your deployment is succeeding?
Oh boy, we use a bunch of things. So at Genetec, since we're a hardware manufacturer and looking at what we do, I'm going to give a really quick synopsis for those who may not know what Genetec does. At Genetec, our core product is video management and access control. So we primarily deal with video cameras and, key cards for buildings and infrastructure. License plate recognition is another thing we do. So we look at it a little bit differently. We love to see success from cities. All of these statistics at the end of the day make a big difference. At Genetec, our tagline is protect the everyday. And I think this is a good example of doing that in a very clear way, just not in a building. We're doing it on the streets. So all of that said, the way we measure our success is a couple things. Is our system easy to use? Is it achieving the results for our customers at the end of the day? So in Chicago, that's increased compliance, that reduction in recidivism. We're looking at those. The easy thing for us to track is operational efficiency. So across all of our customers that use license plate recognition, the average patrol officer in a vehicle, a mobile vehicle equipped with LPR, who is putting tickets onto a windshield, can typically do around 250 vehicle plate reads per hour. And that includes driving down the street, reading plates, finding a violation, stopping, processing that violation, writing the ticket, getting out, putting it on the windshield, getting back in, continuing his flow. When we move to a centralized enforcement workflow where that officer now does not have to stop or does not have to stop as often, and all of those violations are reviewed in a back office, we see that number of plates that they can read in an hour jump from 250 to anywhere between 750 and 1,000 plates per hour. So we see a 3 to 4 time increase in the number of vehicles they can read in the same amount of time. And for cities, that means a couple different things. They can either do more with less, so use the same workforce and cover more ground, or cover the same ground with more granularity. It just makes their job much more efficient and much easier. So, do we meet those goals if we're deploying a system and we're seeing those numbers jump from that 250 to 500, 700, 800 plates that they can read an hour? We know we're doing something right.
That is absolutely massive. And I look at these programs and the successes that they're starting to show. It's notable. I know Santa Monica's ABLE program achieved a 67 to 73% reduction in violations, and New York's MTA automated enforcement program saw a 20% reduction in collisions on corridors where it was activated. When you're in conversations with cities that are skeptical about this and maybe think of it as just a revenue grab, what's the most persuasive thing you can point to?
All of the data like this from Chicago. We can make streets safer. We can make traffic flow much more efficient. There's a number of use cases and a number of studies that have been done in a number of different cities that show when you're doing enforcement correctly, it doesn't even have to be in a bike lane or a bus lane. It could just be with traditional parking. When you're doing things correctly and you kind of reach those target numbers of about 80% occupancy on any given block, traffic flows easier. You see a reduction in traffic congestion. You can see vehicle emissions and air pollution numbers go down. It's not necessarily huge, but you can see an improvement in all of these metrics. So it's not only the hard numbers like, revenue, it's all of these softer, more benefit driven type of improvements that we can make to communities that you see. So it's not just the numbers, it's this whole picture of overall improvement that you can make into a community when you're doing these things right.
Yeah, it's amazing because you have less recidivism, you've got people who are more likely to pay their tickets, you have fewer people challenging tickets and trying to get them administratively released. Those are all really positive improvements. And I look at behavioral change as being as powerful, if not more powerful, in at least the near term, to using cameras to identify areas where designs could be improved. I do think cameras could be a really useful diagnostic tool, telling us where design might be failing. But so few bike lanes are protected, and there's such limited funding to upgrade infrastructure. It just seems to me this is a good bridge. Do you have similar insights on the funding picture for cities?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the Neighborhood Access and Equity Program was rescinded. So that's $750 million gone. Transportation Alternative Program is up for renegotiation with no guarantees. So all of this means that cities, they were looking for this money to help improve infrastructure, make more protected bike lanes, add more bike lanes. All of that money is either gone or up in the air now on whether they're going to receive it. So what that really means for cities is they're going to have to start doing more with less, figuring out ways to work more efficiently, use their existing infrastructure in new ways with incremental changes that may not be as cost prohibitive. So things like what we're doing in Chicago. An interesting thing with what they're doing and how they're doing it is the hardware is no different, essentially, from what they use for traditional parking enforcement from a LPR standpoint. We add one additional camera and an enhanced navigation card to the system. So it's not like adding a whole new system. It's a very minor incremental cost to do this, which means they can actually apply those changes to existing infrastructure for incremental cost and get exponential return on it through operational efficiency. So it all points to that doing more with less. And I think that's what cities are going to have to start doing to really meet the needs of the demands that are being put on them from increased pressure with, additional population, these budget restrictions. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens with cities and how they all start to evolve.
Yeah, I mean, there are studies that suggest something like 60% of commuters in the United States won't jump on a bike because they're fearful of dangerous conditions. And in my mind, a program like this in creating this expectation of enforcement might serve as the deterrent that's necessary to really make people feel comfortable with getting on a bike. Is that your thought process too?
Yeah. And I'm a road cyclist. I've been a road cyclist since I was in my teens. So for many, many years, I have been hit by cars half a dozen times, some relatively serious, some minor, some somewhat intentional, unfortunately. So it's a real problem. And I think, I'm going to go on my rant here for a second on cyclists versus cars.
Yes, please.
I think the problem occurs on both sides, particularly here in the Midwest where I live. There is a bit of an adversarial mindset where a lot of people feel like the cyclists should not be on the road. They should be on the sidewalk, which one is illegal, or they should be in the bike lanes. A number of times the bike lanes are not optimal. The bike lanes a lot of times are not cleaned, or traffic doesn't drive on them as much, so you get road debris in those bike lanes, and you physically, it's safer a lot of times for me to ride in a street than it is in a bike lane. That creates a number of challenges. The other issue I find in having these conversations and debates with people is a lot of people feel that cyclists aren't paying taxes like we do with gas taxes. So we shouldn't be using the roads. We should be using some other alternative routes. That's not very practical. And on the flip side of it, we get a lot of cyclists that run red lights, run stop lights, and don't follow the rules either. And I think on both sides, there needs to be more compliance. And to do that, it goes back to enforcement. Both sides need to feel like they're going to be required to play by the rules. And if you don't, you're going to get a ticket and you're going to get a fine. And I think when we see those fines and those violations pop up, and Chicago's a good example of this, when people feel that they're being watched and there is the risk of getting a ticket, they'll comply. And, that's the bottom line.
It's really a refreshing take by someone who is a biking proponent. I really appreciate that. Typically, we're hearing from urbanists or elected officials. We don't really get to hear from the people who ride their bikes to and from work. So thank you for that. For a city that's watching a program like Chicago's and thinking, hey, I like what's happening there. I like this data, but I don't know where to start. What's the first question that they need to answer?
Really good question. There's a lot of things to look at, and I think it somewhat depends on your particular city. One, identify what you have from an asset inventory standpoint for bike lanes or bus lanes. A lot of cities, I find, they know they have them, but they don't necessarily track them very effectively. They kind of know where they are, but they don't really know how they're being utilized, which would be the second step. Look at those lanes and find out how they're being used. Are they being used effectively for their intended purpose? And how are they being violated against? So, are the buses actually using the lanes? Are they clear enough for the lanes to be used? Are there obstructions? There's a number of times you'll find construction or you'll find weird things that have changed since those lanes were painted. And it makes it difficult for both the cyclists and the bus drivers to actually use those lanes effectively. That would be one of the first things. Once that's identified, take a look at how they're being utilized. How are drivers interacting with those lanes? Are they complying generally? Are there areas where there's physical changes or reasons that force drivers to merge or drive into those lanes where they shouldn't? What are those pain points? Identifying those would be a good first step. If you have all of that data, the next logical place to look would be, how do you enforce it more effectively? So is that using your existing tools, existing infrastructure, existing systems, and then look at how that's being utilized and ways that you can optimize that enforcement workflow. And then once you've done that, it creates this feedback loop. Once you're starting to effectively enforce, where are the areas where there's still problems? Where are the areas where you think you can improve? Do you see compliance go up? If that's the case, maybe move to a different area where you can focus on for a while and start, enforcing that area to get better compliance. It's always this game of whack-a-mole with cities. If you enforce one area effectively, you're going to see compliance drop off in the areas where you're not enforcing as heavily anymore. So it's always this kind of moving target that keeps us all here busy and employed.
I like that response because it recognizes the design challenges, right? And it reminds me of, this story of where people are more likely to speed, right? And there are these roadways that are multi lanes that have little in terms of infrastructure to like slow traffic. There aren't many lights, they're just thoroughfares, and it almost promotes racing, right? And in a similar way, we have design challenges on the curb, but you've also kind of layered in this idea of needing to predict where people are violating. And I'm wondering, for a city that maybe has a program like this, and maybe they aren't moving the needle in the way that a Chicago or a Santa Monica has. Is that the culprit? Not maybe having the assets in the right place at the right time? Or is there something else cities should focus on?
I definitely think that's one of the key pieces. When you have effective systems and ways of tracking that data, usually you can find pretty good numbers that support behaviors, whether that's on your enforcement side or whether it's on driver behavior side. The real culprit is when you don't have the data to look at to make decisions. If you have the data, you can usually make pretty good decisions. It's then figuring out ways to optimize what you're seeing to get your intended results, which is the second piece of that. Not only do you need to have good data, but you need to have good, clear goals in mind of what you want to achieve. When you don't see those two things, or you have one and you don't have the other, is when we run into problems with customers, and you end up seeing programs that just kind of fester and or don't meet the mark and end up getting killed because they're deemed ineffective. And it's not usually because the program's ineffective; it's because one of those pieces is missing, and they're not using both together to really drive to the outcomes they want.
Yeah, as someone who manages a data science team, I can't tell you how important it is to have alignment between between your goals and your data. We've talked a lot about cameras and data and behavioral change, but ultimately this is a story about people who use the streets and that curb lane. I imagine it's not difficult to stay motivated in this line of work for you based on not just this idea of helping people feel safer and to get to where they want to go faster, but also just from your personal experiences with bicycling.
Yeah. Matt, you and I have known each other for quite some time. We've worked together for a number of years. And like most people that work in the parking industry, this is not a career that ever could have imagined when I was a kid or even a young adult that I would be working in this space. But I find it really fascinating and really interesting to see how much parking impacts so many facets of our daily life. It's not just how fast can we get from point A to point B or how much do I have to pay to park. It impacts traffic delivery. It impacts public safety. So, can emergency vehicles get from point A to point B efficiently? How quickly can I go shop? What is the price when I shop? What are tax revenues? It bleeds into every piece of our lives. Even, a good example that I like to give to people is a lot of people say I should be able to park for free anywhere, or I should be able to put my car anywhere I want to within 1 block of where I want to go. The example I usually give to those people is, do you own a house? If they say yes, I say, do you pay a mortgage? Most of them say yes. And I say, well, then you're paying for parking. You just may not know it. How would you feel if your neighbor decided to go park in your garage? You'd probably be pretty upset. It's no different on a public street. We need to find much more effective and efficient ways to do what we do with parking every single day. And the curb is becoming more complex. For people that have heard me speak before, it's not just parking anymore. It's now curbside management. And bike lanes and bus lanes are only two pieces of that. We're now seeing long-term delivery zones, short-term delivery zones, Uber and Lyft pickup zones, no parking zones. Now there's the protected crosswalk areas. So, a lot of cities are now making it so you can't park within 15 or 20 feet of a crosswalk. So there's all of these new use cases that are popping up at the curb that now need to find ways to get people to comply. So it's making our job not only more challenging, but more exciting. And at the end of the day, if we're doing all of our jobs correctly, we're making cities and communities better places for people to live.
Yeah, that's a really important element of the work that you do. It's this idea of creating compliance to allow for improved safety, to allow for throughput, to keep congestion relatively low, to drive access and create fairness. I mean, these are all tied to this notion of deterrence at the end of the day. And deterrence really relies on you have to have your fines set at the right rate, so severity. You need to make sure you're moving things through the processing once a violation's issued. But I think the most critical thing and the factor that smart streets and your technology really focus on is citation certainty. You got to make people feel like the probability is you're going to get ticketed. And that's what I think is so important about what you're doing in the industry.
Most definitely. And I think the other piece to that is that you touched on is making sure the violations are appropriately priced. The number of customers in cities, even the one I live in, you can go into a downtown area that has heavy traffic, high parking demand all the time. And if, say, for example, there's a sporting event, I can park on the street and pay a $12 ticket instead of paying $40 to park in a garage. If that's the case where getting a parking fine is cheaper than it is to park, something's not right.
Right.
You know, and it almost encourages people to break the rules in those cases. So
Yeah, I mean, because what are the opportunity costs, right?
exactly, yeah,
This has been great. Really awesome conversation, Matthew. I'll have to say, having co-presented with you at IPMI, it's always a pleasure to sit with you and get a little bit deeper into this topic. And so I really, really appreciate you being on Parking Live.
been a pleasure and always great talking with you.
And for our listeners, we'll have links to the show notes, as well as the Smart Streets analysis and Genetec's resources online. On behalf of Jade Neville and myself, thank you for listening to Parking Live today.
Thank you for listening. I'm Julie Gates, executive producer of Parking Live. This episode was created by hosts and producers Jade Neville and Matt Darst, producer Chris O'Keefe, editor Patrick Emile, and associate producer Cindy Raskin. Parking Live is brought to you by Modaxo, passionate about moving the world's people. You can follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and visit us online at parking-live.com. Thanks for joining us at Parking Live, where the curb meets the conversation.